We're here today with Howard Keylor, and Howard is going to tell us about his experiences working for the Stockton State Hospital, which originally was called the Insane Asylum of California at Stockton, and was constructed in 1851. Howard, what was your experience there? When did you go to work there?
I went to work there in toward the end of, late 1949, and worked there about 2.5 years as an attendant at Stockton State Hospital. At the time, I think it was the largest state hospital in California. Enormous complex. I worked out at the ranch, which was north of town, where they were mostly chronically ill patients warehoused.
They call it a ranch. Were they raising food out there?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they raised some animals and some vegetables and so forth. And the more functional patients were allowed to do that. But I didn't see anything about the ranch. I was worked in the large wards of the chronically mentally ill people. People get in for a long period of time. Most of them diagnosed as schizophrenia. Patients who never got any visitors, and the patients never got outside except for a handful who did a lot of the work in the wards. But most of the patients never got outside in the sunlight or the fresh air, but were in these locked wards, warehoused, sitting on wooden benches all day long. No newspapers, no books, no radio either, and certainly no television. Just sitting, warehouse, idle, all day long.
And your job was to, can you describe what you were?
They called us attendants, and we were just sort of to look after and see they didn't get into trouble, see that they took their showers when they were supposed to, see that they went to meals, and deal with those who were somewhat agitated or disturbed. But mostly it was just warehousing, because most of the patients were so doped up on phenobarbital that they were somewhat passive and active. Phenobarbital is an extremely powerful sedative that isn't used anymore. It had bad side effects. But these guys were just sitting there soft. And a high proportion of them had been given repeated massive episodes of electroshock treatments, and probably about 10 to 20%, somewhere in that range, had been given prefrontal and transorbital lobotomies.
Right there at the hospital?
Yes, at the hospital. Mm-hmm. They were taken downtown for lobotomies. But Stockton State Hospital, I think, did more lobotomies than any other hospital in the system. Massive. It was almost a mechanized operation.
Now, some of these, could you kind of describe that procedure? Are you familiar with what the lobotomy actually consisted of and how it worked? Sure.
The two different procedures severed the prefrontal lobes. And my observation is that the patients were passive and lost a lot of their social functions and lost a lot of their normal functions. They became sort of vegetative, easy to take care of. I mean, easy to control. But Stockton State Hospital did a lot of them. And the electroshock treatments also left patients dazed and dysfunctional. I was early on dragooned into helping escort the patients and hold them down where they had repeated episodes of electroshock treatment. That's where I got my negative attitudes to electroshock treatment.
So in this treatment, they would have like convulsions.
Yes. They'd have massive convulsions.
And they were disoriented afterwards.
Yes, disoriented, and also changed in personality. Later, several years later, my younger brother, at the age of 16, was confined to Stockton State Hospital, where he had massive electroshock treatments, and later was put on Thorazine. Totally changed in personality and made him dysfunctional the rest of his life.
So was prefrontal lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy treatment and phenobarbital drugging. Did they have any other methods of controlling the patients that you recall?
Well, if you think in terms of medical care, I was quite astonished. I never saw a doctor or a nurse in the common wards out where I worked. The injections, subcutaneous injections of penicillin or insulin were given by untrained attendants like myself.
So they were using insulin as a form of shock therapy?
No, there were a number of patients who were diabetic.
Or diabetic?
Yeah. But insulin wasn't used. The electroshock treatment was a preferred method of treatment.
I see.
Any patient, most of the patients had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But any manifestation of agitation, anxiety, or disorientation, immediately you toted off for electroshock treatments. And if that didn't work, then the prefrontal or transorbital lobotomies, severing the prefrontal lobes.
I would like to get kind of a description of the transorbital prefrontal lobotomy operation itself, because I don't think many people are actually very familiar with that. So, as I understand it, they put probes through the eye sockets into the brain, and they actually have to break through the skull and reach the area where...
Well, they enter the skull through the orbital opening in the skull, and then sever the connections between the two prefrontal lobes in the brain, which results in profound changes in personality and functioning. Patients often became passive, almost totally passive, non-communicative, non-social. A method of control.
But this was hailed at the time as a great breakthrough in care of people with psychiatric problems. Isn't that true?
That's true. It was the treatment of choice. And the doctor who developed the prefrontal lobotomy was given the Nobel Prize for Medicine.
At about the same time you were working there, 1949, I believe.
It was before that. Stockton State Hospital probably did more prefrontal lobotomies than any of the other hospitals. Patients were always being carted off for a prefrontal lobotomy, especially newer patients.
And some of these patients actually died as a result of the operation itself.
Yes, that was sort of well hidden at the time. But later I learned that quite a number of patients, something like 5%, maybe even higher, died as a result of the operation.
And you were working with these patients that had this operation
yes.
on a day-to-day basis, so you were able to observe very closely their symptoms or
sure.
their behavior after the operation.
Oh yes. They were the easiest patients to care for because they were mostly passive, but non-functional.
Now, many of these patients, these were all patients that were being taken care of under this was a public health hospital.
Oh yeah, sure.
Obviously, these were not private patients.
No, it was a public state hospital system operated by the state of California.
And how did they come to be, how did they come to this hospital?
You know, that's an interesting thing. Apparently, it was pretty easy to get picked up and put in the state hospital system. Quite a number of the patients had been picked up off the street. They were homeless or unemployed, or possibly had shown some resistance to law enforcement or something, and taken into the state hospital system. It didn't require very much to get committed to the state hospital system back then. There were even scandals of people who wanted to get rid of an unwanted relative so that they could get hold of their assets of making complaints about them, getting them committed. But once committed, it was very difficult to get out of the state hospital system.
How would you get out?
You didn't. For the most part, you didn't. You just stayed there. You were warehoused forever and ever. I'm serious. Most of the patients in the wards that I worked on never had visitors. So if you didn't have family with some political or financial power, you didn't get out. You stayed there.
So the premise was that you were incurably ill.
Yes, that's right. The wards that I worked on out of the so-called ranch, massive wards, the patients were all classified as chronic, which means permanent. De facto, it means permanently mentally ill.
And the age of these patients ranged from, were there very young patients there? Very
There
old
were patients as young as 18 or 19, up through older. The death rate in the hospital was fairly high. Patients just died. For example, I first worked on the TB ward, where the patients were not only classified as mentally ill, but also had TB. And some of them were bedridden and suffered from bed sores, etc. And many of those died when I was working there. Very, extremely poor health care. I never saw a doctor or a nurse all the time I worked there, except one exception that I'll cite later, the so-called pilot study.
So it was mostly attendants and patients.
Attendants and patients. And the attendants were not trained. They were mostly of uneducated, lower social background, and without any real understanding of patients. Although I did notice a difference. The farm boys were best at dealing with the patients because they had grown up around domestic animals and were accustomed to dealing with domestic animals where you reassure them, you don't alarm them, you're sort of friendly, comforting, and so forth. The farm boys were much better attendants than the city boys who saw the patients as dangerous enemies who had to be incarcerated, who would often resort to physical violence if a patient became agitated.
Did you see cases of people abusing these people physically, beating them, or?
That happened mostly at night, where there was a custom, if a patient was agitated or noisy at night, the attendants would often choke them out with a towel until they became unconscious. And a number of patients died as a result of that. No one was ever punished for it. But we would come to work the next day and find a patient who had been choked out during the night and died. I'm serious.
Yeah. It's quite. You had mentioned that you had seen this movie, The Snake Pit,
Yeah.
which was actually came out, I think, in 1947. It was shortly near the time that you were working.
Yes, I had seen the movie before I went to work in the state hospital system.
And did you find the conditions at the hospital were accurately reflected in the movie, or was that an exaggeration?
They were accurately reflected, so that I still use the term snake pit, although nobody today knows what I'm talking about.
That movie was quite a big box office attraction at the time. As I recall, didn't Olivia de Havilland get an Academy Award for it?
Yes, she did.
So there was a real effort at that time to publicize perhaps the abuses that were going on in these state asylums.
Yes, it's quite possible that they made that movie or allowed it to be circulated. By the way, you can't find the movie today. It's just been disappeared into obscurity. In our earlier discussion today, you speculated that was a time when they were trying to figure out how to dismantle the state hospital system and turn all these patients out of the streets. And that might have been possibly part of the propaganda to justify it. I think you're probably right about that speculation.
Because in fact, after shortly after you left the hospitals, there began a steep decline in the patient population in these asylums.
Sure, they began turning them out.
And it's been speculated that one of the major causes of that was the invention of the new class of drugs that began with Thorazine in the early 50s.
That's right. They started giving the patients Thorazine. That's when my brother got Thorazine. Dope them up on Thorazine, turn them out, and put them on a compulsory maintenance dosage of Thorazine for the rest of their life. That was the way of dismantling the state hospital system. So if you went to Stockton today, there is no longer a Stockton State Hospital.
What's there today?
The area where the Stockton State Hospital used to be located out at the ranch is now the location of the community college. They tore down all the old buildings and they kept a few of them. They built a community college there. Downtown, they converted the buildings into office buildings or public buildings for other purposes.
I understand from my research that there's quite a controversy over the remains of thousands of prisoners that died there that were buried in a cemetery on the hospital grounds, and their remains have been not adequately taken care of. These people are buried in mass graves, no names, and there's a movement of some of the employees of the state disability system that are trying to gain recognition for these individuals, at least in death.
I'm not acquainted with this phenomenon. It doesn't surprise me because I knew that there was a cemetery on the grounds out at the ranch, and since most people didn't have visitors or readily accessible family, they were just buried. They disappeared. Once in the system, without considerable powerful outside help, you were lost in the system, buried in the system.
So you were there till you died?
Yeah.
Essentially,
that's correct.
Now,
no exit.
It sounds to me as if this experience, what was your subjective attitude toward this while you were doing this work?
We could say it was a very painful learning process because I didn't know anything. Although I had an academic background, I didn't know anything about psychology or mental illness or the treatment of it thereof, but I was absolutely shocked and horrified at the system. As a matter of fact, it was a very painful experience because I have a very high level of empathy and empathized with the patients. And very, very painful. But it simply reinforced my distrust of the established ways of dealing with people who have emotional or behavioral problems. It was the worst possible example of how to deal with behavioral problems. In the aftermath with the treatment of with the psychotropic drugs, Thorazine, etc., and the whole pharmacopoeia of psychotropic drugs simply is another aspect of the mistreatment of people who have problems.
So you've had experience with persons with mental problems since then.
Oh, yes.
And in your opinion, have things changed a lot or gotten better, or is it simply another iteration of the same kind of treatment?
It's an extension of and a reiteration of the treatment of people with behavioral problems as if they were criminals. Semi-criminalization with compulsory incarceration, compulsory drugging. Yes, my daughter who lives with me has been confined several times, so-called 5150. And she has to be very careful because once you get a record of 5150, almost anybody can call the cops on you. You're back in the system. And then they shoot you up with some drugs that are counterindicated, and then when you do get out, it's difficult to come down off them. There's very bad side effects.
But this is not well known.
No, it's not well known. It's been difficult for my daughter and I to persuade even some of our relatives just how bad the system is and how counterproductive it is in dealing with the behavioral problems, and how vicious it is, and how dangerous it is even physically. Because my daughter's experiences in my interaction with the staff at the public psychiatric clinic where she was incarcerated several times, I found the staff ignorant, marginal, callous, whose attitude toward the patients is almost as if they were guards in a prison guards. The whole system of the treatment is really counterproductive. They don't really help people very much. The so-called therapy is just drugging the psychotropic drugs. The newest psychotropic, expensive psychotropic drug.
So this is an area that continues. Here you were working in this hospital 60 some odd years ago, and although the abuses today are somewhat different in kind, they continue to oppress people and criminalize them and control them by means of these drugs.
Sure. It's an extension of the mindset of public control and punishment. And it's counterproductive. It doesn't. Many patients are not really helped. In fact, many of them are quite harmed. My daughter, for example, has had terrible side effects with some of the psychotropic drugs that she was forced to take when she was in there. Really terrible side effects.
Could you just, from your perspective, say, if you were asked, and you are being asked, what would you do to make things different? What could we do? Where could we go from here?
It would require an entirely different mindset on the part of public agencies in dealing with people who have behavioral problems. And that would require probably major social change, political change in our society. It's a part and parcel of an ongoing, underlying problem in our society where people who don't quite fit in are not just marginalized, but actually punished and damaged or warehoused. I don't see anything that can be done except exposure in the system, and that's why I'm willing to go to take part in this interview, even though I don't normally give interviews, because I'm 86 years old and I have short-term memory loss and forget words and forget things. But it's something I feel quite passionate about. It's part and parcel of larger social and political problems.
So really it's a deep problem that
it's a very deep problem. It runs
requires going back to fundamentals of science and medicine.
Science and medicine and social responsibility. It's interesting if you're acquainted with anthropology, that societies that deal with behavioral problems as a collective social thing with support and gentle restraint where possible work the best. One of the things that impressed me I was in the Battle of Okinawa, and after the war had some interaction with the Okinawan people, discovered they had a very low incidence of mental illness, even though their experiences during the Battle of Okinawa were really horrifying. 1/3 of the population were killed in the war, in the battle, 3 months battle. But at any rate, they had a societal approach, collective approach to behavioral problems, where everybody took care of and looked after and supported people. And it works. It works. And this is where I want to get into something that's quite interesting. The last period of time I worked in the Stockton State Hospital, I took part in what they call the pilot study. They were desperate to find some way of emptying the hospital, so they set up a pilot study. They had 100 chronically mentally ill patients, and they were organized into groups of 10 with an attendant assigned to them around the clock. And they threw at them every known method of therapy known at the time. Games therapy, music therapy, art therapy, recreational therapy, a bit of psychotherapy, so that the patients were active. They got outside. They interacted with the attendants and with each other. And to their surprise, 80% of them showed distinct improvement, including about 20 to 30% being released. And the psychiatrist in charge of the program couldn't figure out what worked. But the answer was very simple. Instead of being warehoused and suppressed, these patients were, for the first time in many, many years, sometimes decades, were interacting with people, with people who showed them some personal attention, where they got to do things, to talk. They were shown some attention. They were treated humanely. They were treated like human beings rather than potential enemies who had to be suppressed and confined. I'm serious. But the two psychiatrists couldn't figure out why it worked. Anybody with their brains knocked out could figure that out.
Well, this, as I understand it, there's always been a dichotomy within the field of mental health. And one field talks about therapy and human interaction and social approach to this, and the other side is the biochemical theory that says that it's all about brain chemistry and genetics. And apparently today the latter school of thought is very much dominant.
The brain chemistry school is dominant now, yeah.
Right.
Although there's a subset of that which I found interesting. Quite some years ago, decades ago, I read about a study conducted in Canada in which seriously mentally ill patients, schizophrenic, were treated with fairly massive nutritional therapy, vitamins, mineral supplements, and so forth, which resulted in very marked improvements and even cures in quite a number of cases. But that lesson seems to have been somewhat lost in the so-called mental health establishment in the U.S. In my daughter's case, there was her onset of schizophrenia was fairly late in life, late 40s, early 50s, which is not normal with what they call schizophrenia, which, you know, general disassociation from reality. But at any rate, as long as she was taking her vitamins and minerals, she was fine. And then she got into some kind of episode, she stopped taking them, and she had an episode of behavioral problems, in which she became somewhat catatonic and was hospitalized. That's one approach, which I think is often neglected.
Now, did you see any? When did you become aware of the eugenics movement? Was this before you went to work in the hospital or afterwards?
Afterwards. Afterwards. When I was doing also a lot of research and study of the whole history of mental illness and its treatment, and also the whole question of social movements. And I lived in Germany for 10 years, and I found that the eugenics movement had gone to its logical conclusion in Germany, where they exterminated large numbers of people, including children, who, because they were handicapped, even physically handicapped in some fashion, were simply exterminated.
Were you aware of any sterilizations of patients that were going on at Stockton Hospital when you were there?
Not directly, although there was general knowledge that sterilizations were either going on or had been going on. But I didn't have... And wait a minute, come to think of it, there was a point in time, actually soon after I went to work at the state hospital, where I got access to patients' records. Each patient's record was supposed to be updated monthly. There were no doctors or nurses ever out there observing the patients or updating their records. So the charge attendant, who was quite often semi-literate, was supposed to update the patient's records. And because I was literate, I was immediately dragooned into updating the patient's records. So I got to look at the patient's records. And did discover, now I'd forgotten that quite a few of them had in their records that they had been sterilized.
Well, my research, limited research on the hospital, indicates that the former head of the Stockton Hospital, Dr. Smythe, I believe her name was Margaret Smythe, was actually the one that perfected the sterilization operation itself. And the state of California has admitted that they sterilized more than 20,000 people in the mental hospitals in the period from roughly 1913 to 1960. So this procedure was apparently quite widespread and was given impetus by the eugenics movement. Now, today you have advocacy groups like NAMI and the Treatment Advocacy Center that are advocating forced drugging of people with mental problems. Do you see any connection there between...
Yes, I do see. It's the same kind of mindset. You have people who have problems or people who are considered troublesome. So you have to deal with them either by sterilizing them or, as we're doing now, forcing them to take psychotropic drugs and keep them on a total permanent maintenance basis of psychotropic. It's the same type of contempt for and pseudo-scientific method of dealing with people with problems. It's the same kind of mindset. Unscientific, inhumane, and symptomatic of some of the sickness in our society.
And the origins of the advocacy groups today that are promoting this seem to be the same kind of social origins that brought the eugenics movement to us. In other words, it's the upper class, the elites, the wealthy.
I've done some reading, quite a bit of reading, as a matter of fact, and the whole history of the eugenics movement in the U.S. and elsewhere. And it was always the upper classes, the privileged classes, who promoted eugenics, who adopted it as a method of dealing with social problems of poverty, behavioral problems, crime, and so forth. It's the same kind of mindset of victimizing people. It's a mindset of the upper classes, to be blunt about it.
Well, today we're seeing the uprisings of the Occupy movement and social movements around the world, the Arab Spring, and hopefully those movements are going to give us the kind of social movement that we need to confront the realities of the most oppressed among us, in particular which persons accused of being mentally ill are one of the lowest in that hierarchy.
My stepdaughter, who is active in this field, has been quite pleased to find that the Occupy movement is open to taking this whole question up as a major problem which needs to be confronted in our society. It's in its early stages, but it's an opening that I haven't seen for a long time to raise these questions. This whole question of the treatment of people with behavioral problems with psychotropic drugs is one that I've been struggling with for years, trying to talk to people who even activists or leftists who simply don't understand the extent or depths of the damage and harm that's done to people under this rubric of mental health treatment.
Well, Howard, I'd like to thank you for talking to us today. We really appreciate your invaluable experiences, and your outlook on this, I think, is going to help provide that education that we need to move forward.
We have a big job ahead of us. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thank you.